At around 10 p.m. on March 1st, 1932, a nanny named Betty went upstairs to check on the baby she was watching. It was a 20-month-old boy named Charles Jr. When Betty opened the door to his room, her heart dropped. Charles Jr. wasn't in the crib or even in the room at all. She immediately notified the family. So Betty worked for Charles Lindbergh, aka a famous pilot who became the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean without taking a single stop back in 1927. It was a 33.5-hour flight from New York to Paris. In addition to being a well-known aviator, it's important to note that Charles was very controversial and cancel-worthy in the public eye because he was known for being a Nazi sympathizer. That didn't come to the surface until after this incident, but I just wanted to throw that out there to not brush past the past of our country. So after Betty told Charles that his son was missing, he immediately rushed to the room where he found a terribly written ransom note that was left in an envelope on the windowsill with the window open. The note said, "Dear sir, have $50,000 ready. $25,000 in $20 bills, $15,000 in $10 bills, and $10,000 in $5 bills. After 2 to 4 days, we'll inform you where to deliver the money. We warn you for making anything public or for notify the police. The child is in good care." Indication for all letters are signature and 3 holds. With that, Charles called the cops and an investigation began. Officials found tracks of mud on the floor, indistinct footprints, and they also noted the broken ladder on the outside of the building. The ladder was in 2 sections, and it was theorized that it possibly broke during the perp's climb or descent. Even though there was some evidence to go off of, detectives never found any fingerprints or DNA samples to go off of. By the next morning, word about the crime had already spread, and media outlets were going berserk. They dubbed it the crime of the century. One day after the crime, the FBI got involved to try and help the New Jersey State Police and hopefully bring Charles Jr. back to his home. New Jersey authorities offered $25,000 for the safe return of Charles Jr., or who they called Little Lindy. In the beginning stages of the investigation, all of Charles's many employees were interviewed to see if they knew anything about what happened or who was responsible. Charles, who basically took over the role of the lead investigator, then got a few of his friends to communicate with mobsters to try and get in contact with the criminal who abducted his son. On March 6th, 5 days after the abduction, Charles received another ransom note. This time, the perp asked for $70,000. The letter was postmarked on March 4th in Brooklyn. 2 days later, Charles's attorney received a note that said they needed someone to act as a messenger between Charles and his son's abductor. Later that day, a retired principal named John Condon published a statement in the Bronx Home News offering to add an extra $1,000 to the ransom to be the middleman, which was approved by Charles. So at this point, it was March 10th, which was 9 days after Charles Jr. had been snatched. That same day, John was given the $70,000 in ransom money, and he started to negotiate with the perp by posting in newspaper columns under the name Jafsey. The criminal communicated with John through notes he left around New York City like a scavenger hunt. On the evening of March 12th, a taxi driver delivered a letter to John that he received from an unidentified stranger. The note said there would be another note under a rock at a vacant stand near a subway station. In that note, there were instructions about meeting a guy near a cemetery to talk about how to deliver the ransom money. After that, there was a lot of back and forth between John and the perp, and on April 2nd, the perp sent his 12th ransom note with instructions on how John could meet up with the same guy he interacted with earlier. Not to confuse you, but his name was also John. For the sake of the story, we'll just call him Bad John. So Good John met with Bad John that same night to pass the money over. Bad John agreed to bring the ransom money down to $50,000 for whatever reason, and Good John handed it over. Once the handoff was complete, Bad John handed off the 13th note, which stated Charles Jr. could be found in Martha's Vineyard on a boat called the Nellie. But when searchers traveled to Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, there was no sign of the boat or Charles Jr. People continued to search and search for the baby, but he was nowhere to be found. On May 12th, a truck driver found the baby's body buried alongside a highway near the Lindbergh home. The corpse of Charles Jr. was in rough condition. After the body was sent for an autopsy, examiners determined Charles Jr. suffered a fatal blow to the head and had been lifeless for about 2 months. They believed he was snuffed the night he was abducted. Once the heartbreaking news was announced, hundreds of people called in tips. Over 200 people even confessed to the crime, but officials determined their stories were all false. In 1933, President Roosevelt took the U.S. off the gold standard and issued an executive order that recalled all gold coins and certificates over $100 and demanded them to be returned to the government. Apparently, about $40,000 of the ransom money was paid in gold certificates, and each certificate had a unique serial number, so that meant detectives might be able to track down the criminal through the certificates. Lo and behold, in September of 1934, detectives found out about 16 gold certificates that were used in and around the Upper East Side. This caught their attention because that specific neighborhood had a big German population, and detectives theorized the perp was a German immigrant who barely spoke any English, based on the way the first ransom note was written. Turns out, a cashier at a gas station accepted a $10 gold certificate from a man he thought seemed a little sus. After receiving the certificate, the cashier wrote the person's license plate on the back of it, just because the man rubbed him the wrong way. One way or another, investigators found out about this, and they were able to track the certificate back to a German immigrant and carpenter named Bruno Hauptmann. Detectives ended up searching Bruno's home, where they found a bunch more gold certificates hidden in his garage, as well as Goodjohn's phone number and address written in the doorframe of a closet at Bruno's place. On top of that, Goodjohn confirmed with the police that Bruno was the bad John he'd been talking to. Officers felt that was enough evidence to charge Bruno for the crime, so they put him in cuffs and set a court date. During his many interrogations, Bruno claimed he had nothing to do with the crime and didn't even know the money in his house was from the ransom. He said the money was given to him in a shoebox by his friend and former business partner Isidore Fish, who asked him to keep it safe for him. Turns out, Isidore passed away in March of 1934, and when Bruno found out, he looked through the shoebox, and that's when he learned it was full of money. Bruno told interviewers that he kept the money because Isidore apparently owed him from a previous business deal. While Bruno awaited trial, officials were able to recover samples of his handwriting, which they flew to an FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. There, professionals determined Bruno's handwriting shared many similarities with the ransom notes. So now, all of this evidence was starting to pile up against Bruno. Detectives discovered Bruno had a dense criminal record in Germany. He actually tried to come to New York from Germany 2 times in 1923 before he was successful. In his first 2 attempts, Bruno was immediately arrested and deported. But in November of 1923, he finally made it into the US, where he married a waitress named Anna, got a job as a carpenter, and had a son. After receiving the ransom money, Bruno quit his job and started trading stocks. Once Bruno was caught and arrested, he was indicted on execution and extortion charges. His trial began on January 3rd, 1935, and it was one of the biggest and most publicized trials of the 30s. About 700 reporters came to New Jersey to cover it. The trial ended up lasting about 5 weeks, and the case against Bruno was based primarily on circumstantial evidence. In court, the prosecution was able to prove that the tool marks on the ladder matched tools Bruno owned, and the type of wood used to construct the ladder matched wood that Bruno used as flooring in his attic. Prosecutors also brought up the other information we already know, like the scribbles of Goodjohn's phone number and address on the doorframe, the handwriting samples that matched the ransom notes, and the gold certificates in Bruno's garage. When Bruno took the stand, he maintained his innocence. He also talked about how police officers were beating him and claimed they forced him to write handwriting samples that matched the ransom notes. As sad as Bruno's story sounds, most people didn't buy it, including the jury, who found him guilty after 11 hours of deliberation. Bruno received the ultimate sentence and attempted to appeal that sentence twice, but was denied both times. Right before his execution date, Bruno was given a last-minute offer to avoid the electric chair and opt for a life sentence without the opportunity for parole in exchange for a confession. He denied the offer, and on April 3rd, 1936, he was slain. Following Bruno's fatal exit, there was a lot of controversy about the way the investigation was conducted. Some people believed the trial wasn't fair, and even made claims about witness tampering and planted evidence. In the 1980s, Bruno's wife Anna tried to sue the state of New Jersey for unjustly executing her husband, but she was dismissed both times and passed away in 1994, still trying to clear Bruno's name. Other people still think Bruno is guilty, but believe he didn't abduct Charles Jr. alone. There are actually quite a few books written about the incident that pose thought-provoking questions surrounding this case. Since Charles was so involved in the investigation and even contacted organized crime leaders, did he know more than he let on? Was it possible for Bruno to break in without leaving any of his fingerprints? Did the police even conduct a thorough search? Should Bruno have received the ultimate punishment since the case was based purely on circumstantial evidence? Let me know your theory in the comments below, and I'll see you next time for another crazy case.